I tend to want to learn all of my lines, and I do. I work hard.
There are few names in Hollywood that command as much quiet reverence as Sir Anthony Hopkins. For decades, he has reigned as one of cinema's most disciplined, methodical, and fiercely respected figures. He's won Oscars, delivered performances that have carved themselves into film history, and has earned the rare kind of respect that crosses generations. But even a man known for restraint and dignity has his limits. And when those limits were tested, the calm, composed Anthony Hopkins revealed a side few had ever seen. Behind the poised exterior and that iconic, controlled voice lies a perfectionist, someone who approaches acting like a sacred craft. He memorizes every line, arrives on set prepared, and gives everything to his role. To him, acting isn't chaos, it's clarity. But what happens when that clarity meets ego, unpredictability, or sheer unprofessionalism? What happens when the world's most disciplined actor is forced to share the stage with people who thrive on disorder? This story dives into that world, the hidden tension, the clashing temperaments, and the quiet feuds that Hopkins rarely spoke about but never forgot. These weren't the usual tabloid blow-ups. They were silent wars, subtle glances, biting remarks, and reputations built on professionalism quietly colliding with those built on power and personality. And it all begins in 1980 with a film that was supposed to be a sophisticated romantic drama, A Change of Seasons. Hopkins had just gotten sober, stepping into a new chapter of his life with clarity and discipline. His co-star, Shirley MacLaine, was already a Hollywood powerhouse, known for her bold personality, spiritual confidence, and habit of taking charge wherever she went. On paper, their pairing looked promising. In reality, it was oil meeting fire. And Hopkins, the man who valued order and silence, suddenly found himself opposite one of the most outspoken and assertive women in the industry. From the very beginning, their energies clashed. Where he wanted structure, she brought spontaneity. Where he valued privacy, she filled the room with opinions and energy. To the outside world, it was just another film set. But to Hopkins, it became a daily test of patience. Years later, in a rare moment of unfiltered honesty, Hopkins would describe MacLaine as the most obnoxious actress I have ever worked with. Coming from a man who almost never criticizes anyone publicly, that one sentence hit like a thunderbolt. It wasn't just casual gossip. It was a wound remembered. Hopkins never elaborated on what exactly went wrong, but the tension bled into their work. The chemistry on screen felt forced, the warmth manufactured. Critics called the film flat and disconnected, and audiences could sense the lack of spark between its leads. What was supposed to be a mature love story instead felt cold. Two talented people pretending to connect while barely tolerating each other. MacLaine, for her part, didn't deny the friction. When asked about Hopkins' comment years later, she coolly replied, "I didn't like him either, but he was on the wagon at the time, and it was hard on him." Her words carried a mix of sympathy and sting, as if to say she understood his struggle, but not enough to forgive it. NFOR Hopkins. This experience wasn't just another bad partnership. It was a reminder that even the greatest actors can find themselves trapped in creative purgatory when professionalism collides with personality. The man who built his reputation on focus and self-control had met his match in an actress who refused to be contained. And so, what began as a promising collaboration became one of the rare times Anthony Hopkins let his frustrations spill into the open. Because when a man like him, calm, careful, and calculating, calls someone obnoxious, you know it wasn't just tension. It was war behind polite smiles, a clash of values, and a wound that time never quite healed. NTHAT was only the beginning. Because Shirley MacLaine wasn't the last star to test his patience. Not by a long shot. If Shirley MacLaine was a clash of personalities, then Marlon Brando was something else entirely, a clash of legends. Both men were titans in their own right. Brando, the rebel who reinvented acting in the 1950s, and Hopkins, the disciplined craftsman who perfected it decades later. Yet when these two worlds collided, admiration turned into quiet disappointment and respect gave way to disillusion. Anthony Hopkins had always been open about his awe for Marlon Brando's early work. He once said that seeing Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire was like, quote, watching a god appear on screen. That raw, unpredictable energy Brando brought had reshaped acting forever. It gave actors permission to feel, to break the rules, to bleed emotion. Hopkins, a theater-trained traditionalist, admired that courage deeply, but admiration can sour when the idol refuses to grow. When Hopkins saw Brando's later performances, particularly in Morituri, 1965, he was stunned, and not in a good way. He described Brando's acting in that film as one of the worst performances I've ever seen. It wasn't an insult born from ego. It was disappointment from a man who believed deeply in artistic evolution. Anthony Hopkins, Brando represented wasted genius, a man who had once changed the world but had become lazy, detached, and too comfortable in his legend. Hopkins once remarked in an interview, "He gave up. He stopped trying. You can't coast on greatness forever." Those words weren't filled with malice. They were filled with sorrow. Hopkins wasn't mocking Brando. He was mourning what Brando had become. And Hopkins built his career on control and precision. He rehearsed relentlessly, studied his characters like a scholar, and treated every film like a stage play that demanded perfection. Brando, on the other hand, famously refused to learn his lines, relying instead on cue cards and improvisation. He treated acting as instinct, not craft. That difference, structure versus spontaneity, was the fault line between them. In many ways, Brando symbolized everything Hopkins didn't want to become: careless, bored, untouchable. Hopkins saw acting as a responsibility, a sacred craft that demanded respect. To him, turning up unprepared was not just unprofessional. It was a betrayal of art itself. Watching Brando drift through his later roles was like watching a master painter abandon his brush for finger painting. Still, Hopkins never denied Brando's power. He often said that The Godfather and On the Waterfront were proof of his brilliance. But he also warned that talent alone wasn't enough. "If you don't respect your work," Hopkins said, "your gift will turn into vanity." And perhaps, in Brando's downfall, Hopkins saw a warning for himself, a mirror reflecting what could happen if discipline gave way to arrogance. Imagine being Anthony Hopkins, a man who prepared obsessively for every role, watching a once great artist show up late, unprepared, and disinterested. For someone who had spent a lifetime chasing mastery, that must have felt like watching a cathedral crumble stone by stone. In the end, Hopkins's disappointment with Brando wasn't personal, it was philosophical. It wasn't about one bad film or one lazy performance. It was about the decay of devotion. Brando had revolutionized acting, but had grown indifferent to it. Hopkins, on the other hand, had built his entire identity around constant reinvention, self-discipline, and reverence for the craft. When he called Brando's performance one of the worst, it wasn't a jab, it was heartbreak. It was a craftsman looking at a fallen idol and realizing that greatness means nothing if you stop striving for it. To the public, Brando was still a myth. To Hopkins, he was a warning, a reminder that even gods can fall when they forget why they rose. Then as Hopkins's career continued to soar, his disappointment with Brando would become a defining part of his philosophy. Talent fades, but discipline lasts forever. If Marlon Brando had disappointed Anthony Hopkins through carelessness, then Mickey Rourke tested him through chaos. Their meeting on the 1990 film Desperate Hours wasn't just a clash of acting styles. It was a battle between order and anarchy, a collision so volatile that Hopkins later admitted he dreaded showing up to set each day. And at the time, Rourke was the quintessential Hollywood rebel, magnetic, unpredictable, and completely unrestrained. He embodied the dangerous allure of the method actor, the kind who lived inside his character and blurred the lines between performance and reality. Hopkins, on the other hand, was the antithesis of that chaos. He was meticulous, deliberate, and unwavering in his belief that professionalism was the foundation of art. From day one, the energy between them was electric but uneasy. Rourke treated every scene like combat, emotional, raw, often uncontrollable. Hopkins, used to discipline and precision, found that approach maddening. He once said of Rourke, "Working with him was a nightmare. He's unpredictable, and you never know what you're going to get." Non-set, Rourke would reportedly improvise without warning, shifting lines or altering scenes in ways that threw Hopkins off balance. For most actors, that unpredictability might have been thrilling. For Hopkins, it was chaos disguised as creativity. He believed that great acting required clarity and trust, not ego or games. Every time Rourke broke from the script, that trust evaporated. Hopkins wasn't intimidated by Rourke's intensity. He was exhausted by it. To him, acting wasn't about losing yourself. It was about control. It was about entering the mind of a character and then returning to yourself at the end of the day. But Rourke lived inside his roles, letting their darkness consume him. Hopkins saw that as not only unprofessional but self-destructive. NTHE tension grew thicker as filming went on. Crew members noticed the difference in their energies. Hopkins, quiet and prepared. Rourke, loud and unpredictable. What should have been a psychological thriller behind the camera became one in real life. Every scene carried a pulse of genuine discomfort, as though the conflict between their characters had seeped into reality. When Desperate Hours finally wrapped, Hopkins didn't mince words. He told reporters later that working on the film had been deeply unpleasant and that he had no desire to collaborate with Rourke again. Coming from Hopkins, a man known for grace and restraint, that was a rare and cutting admission. NFOR Rourke, the feeling was mutual. He later fired back in interviews, calling Hopkins cold and too rigid, accusing him of not understanding real emotion. But the irony was impossible to miss. What Rourke called emotion, Hopkins saw as self-indulgence. To Hopkins, the job wasn't about feeling everything, it was about portraying it truthfully while maintaining professionalism. Years later, when reflecting on his career, Hopkins subtly referenced that turbulent time, saying, "Some actors believe that suffering makes them great. I believe work makes you great." That statement, though never naming Rourke directly, said everything. In the end, Desperate Hours was both a movie and a metaphor. Two men, two philosophies, trapped together in a confined space, both trying to dominate the story. Hopkins walked away from that set with his sanity intact. Rourke, consumed by his method, spiraled into the chaos he once thought was genius. And for Hopkins, that experience reinforced a truth he already knew. Genius without discipline isn't brilliance, it's destruction. By the time Anthony Hopkins stepped onto the set of Noah in 2014, he was already a living legend, an Oscar winner, a knighted actor, and a man who had long since mastered the art of calm. He had seen everything Hollywood had to offer: fame, failure, redemption, and reinvention. But even decades of experience couldn't fully prepare him for his next co-star. Russell Crowe, another powerhouse of intensity, passion, and ego. On paper, the pairing looked brilliant. Two titans of the screen, sharing the same mythic stage in a biblical epic directed by Darren Aronofsky. But in reality, it was a storm waiting to happen. Hopkins had built his legacy on restraint, a quiet force that simmered beneath the surface. Crowe, on the other hand, was all fire and noise, a man who led with emotion and rarely backed down. Crowe had a reputation by then: fierce, commanding, and at times notoriously difficult. His intensity wasn't just for the camera, it was part of his DNA. He threw himself into every role like a warrior, often demanding that everyone around him meet his same level of ferocity. For some actors, that energy was inspiring. For Hopkins, it was unnecessary chaos. From the first day of filming, the contrast between them was palpable. Hopkins arrived early, prepared, calm. He moved through the set with quiet confidence, offering thoughtful suggestions and speaking little. Crowe, meanwhile, entered like a storm, larger than life, commanding the space, demanding perfection on his own terms. Neither man was openly disrespectful, but there was a visible line drawn between their worlds. Hopkins once described his acting process as monastic. He believed in silence, focus, and stillness. Crowe was instinctual, raw, and unfiltered. Their approaches didn't mesh. Aronofsky, known for drawing emotional extremes from his actors, encouraged intensity. But for Hopkins, that environment clashed with his belief that discipline and control were the true engines of great performance. Behind the scenes, subtle tension brewed. Crowe's booming presence often dominated the set, while Hopkins preferred quiet professionalism. They rarely interacted off-camera, and when they did, it was polite, but icy. Crowe members later hinted that the two men respected each other's talent, but simply didn't click. It wasn't open hostility. It was mutual distance. Two alpha energies circling each other, knowing that getting too close might cause an explosion neither wanted. Hopkins played Methuselah, the ancient and wise hermit, a role that mirrored his real-life energy. Calm, reflective, and timeless. Crowe played Noah, a man tormented by visions, burdened by the weight of destiny. On screen, their dynamic worked perfectly. Off-screen, it was clear they embodied opposite philosophies of what it means to be an artist. And Hopkins later hinted that modern Hollywood had become too self-indulgent, too focused on feeling rather than doing. Though he never mentioned Crowe by name, fans connected the dots. Actors, he said in an interview, sometimes mistake intensity for truth. But real truth comes from stillness. NTHAT line could easily have been a quiet rebuke to Crowe's style, the restless energy that made him brilliant, but also volatile. And Crowe, for his part, maintained his professionalism. He spoke respectfully about Hopkins in interviews, calling him a master, but even his compliments sounded distant, formal, not affectionate. There was no warmth, no camaraderie, just two men recognizing each other's greatness from opposite sides of a chasm. Noah premiered, critics praised both performances. Yet those who knew the behind-the-scenes stories couldn't help but notice the subtext. Two generations of masculinity and artistry, passing each other like ships in the night. And Hopkins embodied legacy, quiet mastery earned through decades of precision. Crowe embodied fire, a restless search for meaning through chaos. Together, they created cinematic tension that elevated the film, even if their off-screen connection never did. In the end, there was no dramatic outburst, no feud splashed across tabloids. Just mutual awareness, a recognition that not every great actor can coexist peacefully with another. Sometimes, the greatest conflicts in Hollywood aren't loud or public. They're silent battles fought in glances, in pauses, in energy that can't be hidden when the cameras roll. And for Anthony Hopkins, Noah was another reminder of an old truth. He didn't need to compete for dominance. His power came from control, not chaos. By 2019, Anthony Hopkins had entered the twilight of his career, but not its decline. At 82, he was still delivering performances that left audiences breathless. That year, he starred in The Two Popes, opposite another acclaimed actor, Jonathan Pryce. On screen, the two men were mesmerizing, Hopkins as the stoic, intellectual Pope Benedict XVI, and Pryce as the warm, progressive Pope Francis. Their chemistry appeared flawless, their debates sharp and soulful. But off-camera, something very different was happening. None like the earlier clashes driven by ego or volatility, this tension was subtler, almost invisible. A quiet incompatibility between two actors who simply couldn't find common ground. Both were British-trained, both revered theater, and both were at the height of their craft. Yet their artistic philosophies couldn't have been more different. Hopkins was instinctive. He followed his gut, relying on pure feeling and rhythm. Pryce, however, was analytical, deeply intellectual, and often lost in thought about motivation and meaning. N.T.O. Hopkins, acting was about doing. To Pryce, it was about thinking. And that divide shaped everything between them. And during the press tours for The Two Popes, fans began to notice the awkwardness. While Hopkins was his usual dry, playful self, Pryce appeared distant, even tense. In interviews, Hopkins would crack jokes or drift into philosophical musings, and Pryce would respond with polite, restrained nods. There was no hostility, but also no warmth. It was professionalism without connection. One journalist later described their dynamic as icy civility. They respected each other, yes, but they didn't like each other. And that emotional distance seeped into their real-life interactions, mirroring their characters' strained relationship in the film. And Hopkins had always been open about his dislike for over-analyzing art. He once said, "You don't need to understand a painting to feel it." The same goes for acting. But Pryce was the opposite. He thrived on intellectual dissection. He wanted to understand the character's soul, the politics, the psychology, every layer of subtext. That kind of approach, while admirable, irritated Hopkins. To him, it turned something sacred into something mechanical. There were no fights, no raised voices. just two men living in completely different creative worlds. During filming, they often kept to themselves between takes. Hopkins would quietly run lines or listen to classical music in his trailer. Price, meanwhile, would discuss theological themes with the director. Their detachment wasn't fueled by disdain, it was rooted in incompatibility. Still, the irony was undeniable. The very tension that divided them off-screen gave birth to one of the most powerful performances of their careers. Their on-screen debates about faith, morality, and forgiveness carried the real undercurrent of two men who didn't quite see the world, or acting the same way. When The Two Popes premiered, critics hailed it as a masterpiece. The chemistry that seemed effortless on film was, in truth, the product of contrast. Hopkins embodied cold intellect. Price radiated empathy. Together, they represented two sides of human nature. And in that collision, something extraordinary happened. Hopkins never criticized Price publicly. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. For a man who built his life on control, working alongside someone who intellectualized every moment must have been quietly exhausting. Yet, out of that exhaustion came brilliance. Proof that even discomfort, in the hands of masters, can become art. And for Hopkins, The Two Popes was the final reminder that not all creative conflict is destructive. Sometimes, it's the very thing that makes greatness possible. When you look back across Anthony Hopkins' extraordinary career, one truth stands out. He is a man who values peace but commands power. He's not an actor driven by chaos, ego, or rebellion. He's a craftsman who finds beauty in control, silence, and precision. Yet, as these stories reveal, even a man as calm and composed as Hopkins has been pulled into battles he never sought. Shirley MacLaine, Marlon Brando, Mickey Rourke, Russell Crowe, Jonathan Pryce. 5 actors, 5 collisions, each testing the patience and philosophy of one of cinema's greatest masters. What do these feuds really say about Hopkins? On the surface, they seem like simple personality clashes. But beneath that, they paint the portrait of a man deeply protective of his art. Hopkins isn't arrogant. He's exacting. He demands respect not for himself, but for the process. And when that process is disrupted by ego, chaos, or carelessness, it offends something sacred within him. From his earliest days at the Royal National Theatre, Hopkins believed in discipline. He studied under the legendary Laurence Olivier, who once told him, "Learn your lines, show up on time, and don't bump into the furniture." That simple philosophy became Hopkins's creed. Acting, for him, was never about fame or mystique. It was about truth delivered through control. Every word memorized, every gesture intentional, every silence meaningful. NSO, when he encountered co-stars like Shirley MacLaine, who dominated the set with energy and control, or Mickey Rourke, who surrendered himself to chaos, he didn't just see conflict. He saw disrespect for the craft itself. To Hopkins, their unpredictability wasn't creative freedom. It was noise. And he had no patience for noise. Even with legends like Marlon Brando, whom he once idolized, Hopkins's disappointment came not from jealousy, but from disillusionment. He saw a genius who had stopped trying. And to a man like Hopkins, there's no greater sin than abandoning your own potential. The same pattern echoed through the years. With Crowe's volatility, Price's over-intellectualizing, different faces, same frustration. He could work with almost anyone, as long as they respected the work as much as he did. NBUT. Perhaps the most revealing part of Hopkins's journey isn't the clashes, it's his response to them. He never exploded publicly. He never sought revenge or gossip. Instead, he quietly moved forward, choosing solitude over confrontation. His revenge was excellence. His answer was always the work itself. And Hopkins often describes himself as a, quote, loner. He doesn't attend Hollywood parties, rarely mingles with other stars, and prefers quiet evenings at home with his piano or his wife, Stella. He once said, "I don't need friends in this business. I just need peace." That statement sums him up perfectly. For Hopkins, success isn't about applause. It's about serenity. It's about mastery earned in silence. And yet, for all his restraint, these feuds show that Hopkins is profoundly human. He feels frustration, disappointment, and even contempt when his values are challenged. But instead of lashing out, he transforms that emotion into art. You can see it in his eyes when he plays Hannibal Lecter, in the weary sadness of his character in The Father, or in the stoic calm of Pope Benedict. The stillness of a man who has seen chaos and chosen not to be consumed by it. In the end, Anthony Hopkins' story isn't about the actors he disliked. It's about the standard he refused to lower. His clashes weren't fueled by arrogance, but by integrity. Each one reminded him, and the world, that discipline is the backbone of greatness. NSO, when people look at Hopkins and see the quiet dignity, the poise, the mastery, they often forget the battles it took to maintain it. The truth is, he's not just a brilliant actor. He's a survivor of Hollywood's emotional wars. A man who built a fortress of calm in a world addicted to chaos. And perhaps that's his greatest role of all. Not Hannibal Lecter, not Pope Benedict, not Odin, but Anthony Hopkins himself. The actor who chose control over chaos, grace over ego, and art over everything else.